welcome to the RiskPal 2026 Journalist Safety Outlook. And Happy New Year. It feels like 2026 is already 6 months in by the amount of news that we've had in this first 13 days. And so it's looking like it's going to be another bumper year in terms of news events and journalism safety. And we're really, really grateful to the panel, who I'm going to let introduce themselves. But we're very, very grateful to the panel for being available to us. They've got fantastic stories from 2025 and beyond, and are sort of the crystal balls of the news world in terms of what awaits us in this next 12 months. So let me just start by I want to introduce David. I'll let David introduce himself, but I'm just going to start with the people on my panel. So David, do you want to just tell the audience who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is David Baumgarten. I'm the general counsel of The Atlantic magazine, based in DC. Work across all of our teams with our business and our newsroom, and with our newsroom dealing with all the legal issues as well as security issues and everything in between.
Okay, great. And we're very lucky to have David here because he should be on jury service, or was let
Still,
off from jury service.
still on call. Was in yesterday, back tomorrow. Fell right in the sweet spot here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And Rana, do you want to tell us what you've been up to?
Sure. Hi, my name is Rana Ayyub. I'm a global opinions writer with the Washington Post, and I'm an investigative journalist based in Bombay, India.
Okay, great. And we're lucky to have Rana because she's just returning from a court case, I should say. So
Yes.
lots of legal issues on all over the globe in this panel. And Phil, are you being sued? Any defamation cases against you?
I'm sure we have some, or at least some threats. People seem to threaten to sue more than they sue. But yeah, I'm Phil Chetwynd. I'm the global news director of AFP, the international news agency, and based in Paris, and with sort of overall responsibility for a newsroom that spans 1,900 journalists across the world, in pretty much every country in the world.
Great. Well, listen, as I said, I'm very grateful for you for doing this and I'm very honored to have worked with you at some point in the past. Hope to work with all of you again. And just a couple of logistical points. This session is being recorded, and we will release a highlight reel after the event. But just in case you want to ask questions, please note that it's being recorded. And secondly, just before I started this session, as always, someone started drilling in the building above me. So if you hear any strange noises, that's just the workmen upstairs gutting a house above me. Anyway, let's get started. Like I say, it really feels like we've been in 2026 for a very long time. And I want to start off with Phil because it's been 13 days of really hard news. Venezuela, Iran. These are traditionally two very hard countries to cover from a journalistic perspective. And Phil, how is AFP going about these stories?
Different in the two cases. I think Venezuela, well, we have a staff in Venezuela probably of about 10, and obviously stringers around the country and a big presence in Colombia. So, Venezuela was something we could sort of prepare about, as it was telegraphed, pretty well by the Trump administration that something could happen, whatever that may be. So we were able to, really step up training in advance, preparedness, where we were going to go, how we would extract people, even manage to get more protective gear into Caracas for the teams. So we have a lot of Venezuelan journalists in exile, so that means, and they can still get into the country. So that means we could, we could reinforce from Colombia through the land borders and so on. So that was a reasonably ordered in a way, and remains ordered. We've been able to cover pretty well. We know the country, so so far so good. Iran is a whole different ballgame. We, I think, are the only international news agency that still has a functioning bureau in Tehran, which comes with its advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages is that you have people on the ground who are very vulnerable to a regime that plays pretty hard especially towards local Iranian journalists. So the restrictions and the intimidation and so on are pretty ferocious. And then, of course, just the whole matter of communication. We've had periods of 48 hours of just not being able to communicate at all with our teams inside Iran. Again, with Iran, we're used to setting up alternative coverage outside, teams working in Farsi, working with XR groups, working on social media content and so on. But it has to be said, it's pretty rock and roll inside Iran just because you don't have that level of communication. You don't have that ability just to communicate with your teams and put proper processes in place.
Okay, and obviously this is a journalism safety outlook, so we're really focusing on the safety issues. And for members of the audience who didn't attend last year, they might not know that AFP has sort of renovated its safety and security infrastructure internally. How do you feel AFP? Well, can you tell the audience a little bit about what you had to do, why you had to do it, and if you feel it's setting you up for these kind of heavy stories that you're covering now?
Yeah, I think in all of them it helps. I mean, what I think what we've really done is I think really stepped up massively on preparedness. I think that probably the trigger was losing somebody in Ukraine. One of our journalists was killed in Ukraine, and I'm not sure that anyone did anything wrong on that day. But what it really was the trigger for a reset of really looking at conflict and difficult country reporting and putting huge amounts of resources into new types of training and in particularly into preparedness and looking at how you will react to different scenarios as they come along. I would say we really saw the benefits of that with Venezuela, as I said before, because we did do a lot of preparation and a lot of scenario planning, and so we felt we were reasonably comfortable with that. I would say, and then of course with Iran, what it shows is you can only go so far. You can only go so far with your protocols and with training and so on. You get situations like Gaza to some degree, but also like Iran, where you really have to rely on the team on the ground, the good training of the managers, the things you've tried to put in place, but you have literally limited ability to influence things day to day. So I guess important there is the training that you put in place on both a management level and on a security level.
Okay, and I don't want to forget about Gaza because nothing much has been reported from Gaza this year, but obviously it's the story that's killed the most amount of journalists in living memory of ever. What do you think is going to happen there this year, Phil, in terms of journalism safety? Is it much of, are internationals going to get in?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's very depressing. And I think one of the things that I found very, very difficult is the lack of pressure, diplomatic pressure, country pressure, really pressure from anyone, even a coordinated pressure from the news industry to make, to open up Gaza to reporting. When I say reporting, international reporting, any reporting. I mean, our Palestinian journalists that we exfiltrated from Gaza, a year ago, would love to get back in and report. They can't get back in. So I think I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about the precedents that have been set. That if you can just exclude the media from a situation, there are no eyes on it, and that you can have a really concerning situation on the ground with not enough good journalism to follow. So I'm very concerned about certainly the precedent that is set in Gaza. We work with journalists in Gaza. We do our best, but again, we have limited ability to help them and influence them. We can get them money. We can give them advice. We can try to help them as much as we can materially. But we do rely on them and their own ability to navigate the situation that they have.
Okay. And I am conscious across the pond, for me at least, in the States, there are protests in the streets in Minneapolis. David, have you got people covering that? How is the Atlantic responding to what's happening at street level in various parts of America right now?
Yeah, we don't have anyone on the ground in Minneapolis right now. We certainly have had folks covering protests in other places over the past few years. And again, it's what Phil has said, right? It's training ahead of time. with the journalists who are going to go. It's having systems in place to make sure we're checking in. It's making sure we have the gear folks need to stay safe. And it's honestly relying on networks of support. There's a number of different journalism safety networks that I and other folks I work with are in touch with to make sure we're staying up to date as much as possible and understand the situation on the ground.
Yeah, and listen, sorry to put you in this position because you don't represent all of the US media, but do you think the US media are prepared for protests better than they have been? I mean, obviously they've gone through Black Lives Matters in recent history, but do you think it's now a sort of relatively mundane story for them to cover a protest in the street?
I don't think it's mundane. I do think we're all a lot better prepared. I think the level of sophistication in sort of in these networking conversations we're having in these groups that talk about journalist security, I think everyone, the sort of baseline level of what folks are doing has clearly been increasing over the past, decade really now at this point. Right? It's not just a year or two, right? I think that there are obviously access issues, right, with covering protests, and our, local police or local law enforcement going to try to prevent folks from getting access, and that continues to be an ongoing issue, and that may get worse before it gets better.
Okay. And Rana, I want to bring you in. Obviously, India had its fair share of violence, protests. Last year, there was a war between Pakistan and India. How do you feel the Indian media is doing in comparison to what Phil and David have just said in terms of preparation, training, and taking risks seriously?
The situation in India is a little more different than, say, the rest of the world, because we are dealing with a situation where we do not have an independent press, right? We have, India ranks 165th in the World Press Freedom Index, and the world's largest democracy is not protecting its journalists. So we have a very, very different concern. Because, we have protests, we have the war between India and Pakistan, but what really needs is a check on news organizations that are actually amplifying the war cries as opposed to doing due journalistic diligence, right? And I think that is the biggest problem in the Indian media right now, because we have most of the mainstream news channels in India have become the cheerleaders of the Modi government, right? So the news that you're really getting are either from the YouTubers, journalists who are covering the protests, journalists who are covering wars, who are on YouTube, who have their own personal independent platforms, who have their own Substacks, and journalists who write for international publications. So what happens is these journalists do not really have any protection, which a mainstream media offers in terms of, when you're covering a situation like this. So they're left to fend for themselves. So we are at a very, very sensitive place right now. I sit on the jury of multiple international journalism awards, and there are all these concerns about journalists in Gaza and Sudan and Ethiopia. And over the last few years, we have seen that a lot of these journalism organizations are now suddenly talking about what's happening in India, because nobody really saw India as a country where journalists and their lives would be under threat. But over the last few years, there has been a very, very sensitive case for press freedom, where the world does not really talk as much. Our problem is not about aggression internationally from foreign forces. Our problem is the aggression from our own government, which is, the number of journalists who have been killed in India over the last 2 or 3 years, the number of journalists who have not been allowed to report, who have cases against them, has increased over the last 2 or 3 years. So journalists in India are the new enemies of the state. And that capacity, I think our situation is much, much different from anywhere else. Our democracy is not protecting our own journalists.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on this panel, Rana, is because what you've been experiencing for the last 15 years, the West has kind of been going through more recently. And, one of the things you have experienced longer than probably most other journalists even knew about sort of online threats is you have been the victim of a sustained online campaign against you. What is it like to be trolled?
I mean, it's like it's one thing to be trolled by anonymous bots, but it's another thing to be trolled by the state mechanism. When the state trolls you, when the ministers troll you, when the civil society trolls you, and not just troll you, they kind of set an example by spreading misinformation and disinformation about you, your family, putting on address, my socials, everything on social media, targeting my family members, death threats, rape threats. But most of these rape threats come from accounts that are followed by the Prime Minister of India. A lot of these misinformation is spread by ministers of the ruling government, right? And I think I have passed the stage where I really get threatened because of trolling. I think I'm at a stage where the online has now seeped into the offline, where what used to happen to me on the internet is now happening to me in person. And Colin, you know this, the kind of calls that I get on my phone. I mean, this year, we all got on a call because I got death threats over a person who was calling me on a video call, a dreaded gangster who has been targeting Indian critics in Canada and the US. He called me 2 months ago on a video call saying that he's going to kill me if I don't write an article in the Washington Post praising a certain fundamentalist organization. So I think I live with that. Besides the fact that the government is using its machinery to discredit me, putting a deep fake image of a porn video of me, putting out fake morph tweets of me on the internet, sending burned copies of my book at my residence with blood splattered all over it. I mean, think of the worst scenario, and I've faced it. And I can say this, that I spend more time in courts and with investigative agencies than I should do with my journalism and with my reporting. I think that's what is happening in authoritarian regimes, that they kill you by 1,000 cuts. So when they're not killing you, when you're not killed by a regime, they silence you, and they silence you with censorship, they silence you with court cases, they silence you with online, offline intimidation. And I think that's very dangerous. And I'm just a symptom of what's happening globally to journalists.
Okay. Sorry, before I go on, I should just say apologies to the audience. I should have said, if you have a question, please put it into the questions and answers, the Q&A, and I'll pick them up and answer them. I could see someone had their hand up wanting to say something. So just put it in the chat and I'll ask the panelists the question when the opportunity arises. So what's happening to you is a symptom, you're saying, but look, I've had to give you advice, as of other colleagues of ours, our security colleagues of ours. How do you feel about the advice we give you? Do you think it's any good? I mean, this whole audience is full of security people and, editors. How do you feel when we say don't feed the troll and things like that?
Honestly, Colin, I mean, you guys give practical advice, sensible advice from experience, but at the end of the day, and with no offense, but to everybody, including security people at the Washington Post, at the end of the day, I have to live the reality, right? And oftentimes, I don't feed the trolls, but sometimes what has happened over a period of time is that there is so much misinformation about me, and so much fake news about me, that because I have not reacted about it, and these are on mainstream platforms, they have become my reality, right? Because I am not contesting them, they believe that I am that this is the truth, this is the original news, or this is the authentic news. And that bothers me sometimes. And when I'm trending on the internet, if I'm the #1 trend in India, right, a country of 1.4 billion people, and I see that people are consuming all the fake news about me, my family, my integrity, my character, the way I am as a person, and allegations of corruption, etc., it bothers me. And as much as they call you brave and courageous, at the end of the day, you have to live with that reality. And the reality is there is an entire system out there to besmirch you. And when you step out in a country where there is majoritarianism in full force, when you do feel like you are alone in the fight, and you might have allies, and you might have a news organization behind you, and you might have colleagues to help and support you, but when you are made to go through something like this, you feel alone. And That is what I've understood speaking to journalists all over the world who have been persecuted. That at the end of the day, we all feel isolated and alone because we are the ones dealing with the case. I'm not in exile. I'm in my country. I'm dealing with the case. I just came running from one more court case. It's a defamation case over an article I wrote in 2008. And suddenly in 2024, they have realized that the article was defamatory, only to kind of intimidate me. But the thing is, I have to go through this thing. I have to go to court. I have to sit with investigating officers. I would rather spend that time doing my journalism. I would rather spend that time sitting with my family as opposed to just doing this all the time. So it's exhausting.
Yeah, well, we have a global head of news and a head of legal counsel on this call. David, if Rana walks into your office, if she was one of your journalists or freelancers, she said the system is there to besmirch her and she feels incredibly isolated. I'm sure you've had to deal with this on numerous occasions with your staff. How are you dealing with this at the Atlantic?
Yeah, I mean, so look, we've certainly dealt with any number of challenging situations. I don't think we've dealt with anything like what Rana's describing, right? That is still beyond what we're dealing with in the US. Now, are we on the pathway there? That's another conversation. I guess I'll say a couple that we're always going to be focused on the safety of our folks who are facing this sort of intimidation. And that has to come first, right? And that physical safety and that starts with obviously good online safety and security. Two is that I do think we have largely given the same advice that Colin, that you all give, which is don't feed the trolls. But I think where when we feel that there is a need to speak out on something, how we think about that is through doing journalism, right? And so if there is a story about intimidation or a story about the legal climate or a story about what is affecting journalism, I think there have been times where we've, encouraged folks to, sort of write a little bit about what they're going through as part of that. And that's how they sort of correct the record in a way, right? We had one of our reporters who has done some incredible reporting on the death penalty in various states in the American South, who was thrown out of the Alabama state jail system, essentially. And in writing one of her pieces, sort of explained what happened and sort of made it clear, right? And took that step to sort of correct the record. So I do think I do think the advice of, not engaging with individual trolls is still what we're saying. But at the same time, when there is sort of systematic things, that at some point becomes part of the story, and there are ways to write about it journalistically.
And Phil, I mean, you have 1,900 journalists under your care. Do you have a system to deal with this? How do they report it? How do managers deal with this? It doesn't all come to you, obviously. How is AFP countering this?
It doesn't all come to me. So, but we do have a kind of a system where we don't want people not to report it. So we really want everything pushed up the line. So we have a security team that logs the threats, takes them seriously. We discuss, how to respond, how not to respond. We think it's very concerning when people just get used to seeing that. I think some of the teams for us that are in the most front line, we have a large team that works on misinformation, disinformation, what was called fact checking, digital verification, and so on. And that is something, particularly in the States, actually, but not just in the States, that provokes, extremely aggressive trolling, really, really unpleasant trolling, death threats, rape threats, and so on. So it's really important that we look at all that all the time and understand when to respond. We all have that same instinct not to feed the beast, as it were. I think there are many times when we've given that advice. Having said that, I've also taken the position, in particular on Gaza, I took the position to speak up when our reporters were being abused, because I felt they were in grave danger from lies and misinformation about who they were and what they represented. And so I felt one of the only things I could do for them was to speak up for them and to say that I know who they are, that they are, award-winning journalists who, deserve all the protections of the Geneva Convention and everything that goes with that. And in some ways, I felt that I was giving them a little bit more security by doing that. So it does depend a little bit on the circumstances.
Okay, and while you're on, there is a question directed at you, which you mentioned new kinds of training that AFP is doing.
Yeah.
Is that something you can elaborate on?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that evolves all the time. I think probably reflecting really the change. I mean, the Ukraine war, if we look at what the skills were needed at the beginning and what the skills are now, is changing a lot. I think one thing we learned a lot from several incidents in Ukraine was the need to do really, really serious first aid training, sort of combat first aid training, so that if someone was seriously injured, their colleagues would really be able to save them, not just having, done an afternoon of applying bandages or a tourniquet, that you can really, save the person's life. And we've had various incidents where we've certainly saved people's lives because of that. So we've been really, really doubling down on everything around first aid, 3-4 day intensive first aid combat training courses. That was really one of the most important things. And then obviously a lot more on cybersecurity, and how to help people protect their digital space. I think, again, going back to Ukraine and drones and everything that's gone there. With Ukraine, we particularly developed a drone training course because, the threat from the air was so significant that we felt that, we need to help people understand, what that is. So it's quite a moving territory. But I think we had to get away from the previous protocols, which were sort of, I guess we felt were more sort of Iraq war, Afghan war focused, a lot of checkpoints and fears of, the kidnapping and things like that. That doesn't mean that those things aren't relevant anymore. But we realized some of our training was too focused on that, given the new threats that we were facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the speed of technology on the battlefield is quite frightening, really, in terms of new threats emerging. But I just want to go back to this issue that we're talking about when it comes to digital safety or online threats and, physical harm. Journalists are kind of enduring an age of cruelty, which we've been in for quite a while. But one of the things I noticed last year is we're also sort of entering an age of capitulation, where media organizations are bowing before defamation cases in quite a frightening way. And, this is particularly true to the environment that David finds himself in. David, can you elaborate on this a little bit and just tell us what it's like to, when you see your colleagues and counterparts paying out vast sums of monies to the government or to the president, and start there, and I'll ask you a bit more about it as we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really disheartening. I think much has been made in sort of American media law circles over the past 5-10 years, is actual malice, which is our critical standard for protecting our journalist's ability to do work on public figures, public issues. Is that crucial Sullivan standard at risk? Is there interest in overturning that? And I don't know, that's still an existential threat, right? The loss of that standard would be very bad. But I think what the past year has shown is that corporations unwilling to take advantage of that standard and fight cases that certainly appear to be meritless from my vantage point is just as damaging. And so that's it's tough it's certainly tough to see and very disheartening to see.
Just from a practical perspective, I mean, you worked on one of the sort of defining stories of 2025, which is Signalgate.
Yep.
I mean, in this environment that you're in, your editor, Jeff Goldberg walks in and says, David, I think I'm in a single group with the leaders of the free world. What goes through your mind legally when, how do you catch that? Or what do you think about it at that point in time?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with something that Jeff wrote about in the initial story, which is he didn't walk in and say, I think I'm in a group with the leaders of the free world. He said, I think I'm in a group, I'm being trolled. I think this is a disinformation campaign, right? That was Jeff's first reaction, my first reaction when these signal chats first started going in. It just seemed truly insane that this would actually be happening. And in the piece that Jeff wrote, he explains how over the course of being in this group for 5-6 days, increasing indicia of this being actually a real thing, start coming in, or at least an incredibly sophisticated disinformation campaign. I should say, right, Jeff has been targeted by name by President Trump. He has received all sorts of threats. Other Atlantic journalists have certainly been targeted by disinformation campaigns. So it's a realistic fear, right? To think that. But in any event, over the course of the week, the sort of balance shifted from 90-10, this is different information, to starting to believe this was real. But once the signal chains come in on a Saturday morning saying here's the bombing time and what's going to happen, and then the bombing starts, now we're at 90-95% certainty that this is real. But before publication, right, we still did go to the White House and to the National Security Council and others to say, hey, we have these chats. It seems like these were real. Can you confirm, right? We still we're going to do that work of actually going, and going for comment and going to confirm it before we published. So yeah, that's sort of the thought process.
Sleepless nights. I mean, did you think, what if we get this wrong? I mean, the BBC got something wrong with Trump late last year, and the management had to go.
Certainly a lot of sleepless nights. I think I was getting it wrong is always a concern, right? You're always thinking through all the possible permutations of how, okay, it's starting to look more and more real. How could a disinformation campaign actually have the bombing coordinates just before? And so you're worried about that, but also I trusted our process. I trusted that we were doing this in a responsible way, right? At no point early on, before sort of everything came to a head, was there any indication of, we should just start rushing this to press, right? We were going to report out the story and meet our standards. I'm lucky to work at a place that has both those incredibly high standards, and also our mission is not about just being first to break news. It's about getting news right and providing context. When we break news, that's great, but it's a bigger picture thing. But the sleepless nights were coming from the fact that I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but for an administration that we know has spoken about targeting journalists with criminal, charges, we were 100% confident everything we were doing was fully legal and protected by the First Amendment. But it was not that hard to start coming up with, some very scary scenarios where, one type of retaliation or another based on, a pretext of a pretext ensued. And then, even though, again, we felt we were 100% on solid ground, thanks to the First Amendment, you're still embroiled in something that's messy and scary and time consuming for everyone. So certainly a lot to lie awake at night thinking about during those 10 or 11 days.
And following the story, did you see an uptick in abuse of Jeff, The Atlantic? Did you see any sort of physical risk manifesting themselves? Were you at all physically scared? For the staff, I mean, not just yourself, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, look, Jeff has been called out by name by the president at rallies a number of times, dating back to the fall of 2020 when he broke the suckers and losers story, as it's known, right? This was President Trump calling military casualties and injured veterans, suckers and losers. And so we have seen, and then that's come back every couple of years. There's an ad referencing that or something. And so we do see spikes in online threats, online traffic. There are certainly times that we take increased physical security measures for Jeff and others around the Atlantic. So yeah, it was something we were monitoring, something we were preparing for, and did take seriously for sure.
And just moving across back to Rana, you don't have a head of legal counsel to protect you. You have to go to court by yourself or with your personal lawyer. How does this work? You're a freelancer. How do you protect yourself legally and physically when you're in the courtroom or, going about your day-to-day life, Rana? Because you have been attacked. You were assaulted in an airport, weren't you, once?
Yeah. So I have come really close to a physical assault at the airport, at the immigration because once you set up a journalist as the enemy of the state, especially if you belong to a minority community in the country, you're not just seen as a journalist, a regular journalist, but as a Muslim journalist. And that is the worst case scenario in a Hindu majority Indian country. So when you set up somebody as a target, then physical safety becomes a huge concern. I get so many messages, and this about, when I'm traveling, somebody will send me a DM saying, I just saw you with your nephew or niece, and, you should not, just basically letting me know that they're following me. And I think, and the point here is, how much can you hide? I've been offered police security. The cops have offered to protect my house. But the thing is, how long can they do that? They can't be following me everywhere. The worst part of this situation is that when you go on and report on stories, and when the intelligence officials follow you, they come to your hotel, they come to your Airbnbs, they check your bags, they follow you everywhere in a car, they snoop on you, they do surveillance on you. This happened just last year. And I recorded a few of the intelligence officials following me everywhere while I was doing a very crucial story on the border, the Indian border areas. And I feel like I don't know what security feels anymore. I don't know how much can I rely on either my organization, which is, to be fair, on the Washington Post, for whom I'm a columnist, they have tried to do as much as possible. But at the end of the day, I live in India, I live in Bombay, and they really are not getting anybody, including my own counsels. And these are for cases that have been, leveled against me since I was a journalist for an Indian journalism organization. I pay my own fees, and literally 70% of my salary every month goes in my legal fees. But I guess that's still bearable. It's basically the emotional cost and the mental health cost here, because it is one thing to report on a court procedure of other high profile cases, but it's another to sit in a courtroom and be the subject of it. And I think that's not easy. Not knowing that you step out of court and the people who have sent you death threats, knowing fully well that you are in court and they know all your location. So when you're doxxed and somebody puts out a tweet that Rana is going to be in this court tomorrow, teach her a lesson, I don't know how do I really protect myself. Because if they don't get me tomorrow or next week, they might get me the week after. So you're literally watching over your back, and you get edgy after a point of time. You're exhausted watching over your shoulder every time, because it's not easy. And especially if you're as somebody who's an investigative journalist who's been reporting on stories on national security and intelligence officials, it is crucial for me to know that when I meet somebody and when I meet sources, am I risking their lives too? Because if somebody's snooping on me, the person is also snooping on my sources and the people I'm interviewing, which has happened. The last time I went on a story, the people who I interviewed called me and said, there are police officials who have come at our doorstep wanting to know, what did we tell you? And I think that is a situation where you feel like it is impacting your journalism, which you love the most, right? What I really hold dear more than anything else is my journalism and my ability to report. So when you take away that right of mine, when you create a problem in me and in my reportage, I think that hurts quite a bit, because that's my identity. I would prefer being known as somebody who's a journalist who's on the ground, as opposed to somebody who's a victim of something, right? I'd rather be
Yeah.
known for my journalism and my story. So I think that is what hurts the most, when you are unable to do your own journalism because you're putting others at risk because of the threats to you.
Yeah, and journalists don't get paid a lot of money. It's really about the identity and the mission of being a journalist. And like Phil, when you hear Rana saying this, how in terms of mental health, there's a question in the chat about how do you sustain people's mental health. You must have teams all over the world going through what Rana's going through to a certain degree.
I must admit, Rana's case sounds, really extreme, and I know in India it can be really hard. I have had cases where we've had to exfiltrate people from countries. I mean, two areas that are very hard for us at the moment are certainly Central America and the Sahel region of Africa. So we've had to take people out of those situations, a combination of virtual threats and real threats. And it is really important, the level of support you can give, both material and everything around potentially mental health and so on, because as Ran has rightly pointed out, it's your livelihood, it's your essence, it's who you are, so that they're losing a lot in the process. Often people are leaving their livelihoods behind, their families, their friends, and so on. So that there's a huge sense of also moral injury. That's the story you've been reporting on. It matters to you.
I think we've lost Phil. I think he's frozen. David, obviously, this is a story that's,
and in some cases,
Phil's back.
That is a sort of changing culture.
Great. Phil, we lost you a little bit, so missed out a bit on what you were saying in the middle, but let's continue. Phil, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. You're moving around. One of the things, the issue with Rana is obviously she's a local journalist reporting in India. You mentioned Venezuela. You have local journalists reporting in Venezuela. You have local journalists reporting in Iran. And, AFP has always had that kind of model, but increasingly we're seeing across the international media that they are relying more and more on locals to do the news and less parachuting of international journalists in, which is in some ways is a good safety thing, but at the same time is very dangerous for the people when you leave them after you've left the story. How do you feel about the localization of news and what's its impact on safety?
Well, I think, have a slightly different view on that, in that what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years, of course, is the kind of the rise up in talent of, I guess, people who in the past we thought were local journalists. So we've had, as I just said to you, we had a whole series of excellent Venezuelan journalists who've been working in our network around the world, in Los Angeles, in Washington, in Beijing. We've had this real internationalization of our global footprint. So we still work on a combination of what I would call senior journalists and people from there. Iran, we still have two people who are not from Iran, and they can clearly do things that the local Iranians cannot do, for example. So depending on the circumstances, I think it's really important to keep a balance of, I wouldn't say, one thing we get away from is not Western journalists and local journalists. It's sort of international profile journalists and journalists really from that location. Of course, there are places where really you can have an entirely local team because the threats or the circumstances are very different. But what's really important in difficult places is that we have a management that can protect people. We have a system in place where we're not leaving people in dangerous places. And I think we sort of managed to do that a bit. One of the things that's really important, of course, also is with the internationalization of talents, is that you end up, of course, with managers in difficult places who often do speak the language of that place. All our managers in our various Middle East bureaus are all fluent Arabic speakers. They may be from that country, or they may be from a country nearby. So I think we slightly come to a different model than perhaps you're describing.
Okay, but one of the downsides of this model is obviously you have a lot of international people in different places, and you've had quite a bit of difficulty in the US with your international staff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, can you go into a bit of detail about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems you're seeing at the moment is, of course, which comes from China and Russia, I guess, originally is sort of visa war, the use of visas as a weapon against journalists. So, it goes with the whole immigration debate globally. You're seeing the use of visas as a way of controlling staff, as a way of stopping you doing your work. So obviously the new regulations, which are not in law yet from the Trump administration, would limit what we call I visas in the States to, I think it's 210 days. And then you would have to apply for another visa for 210 days. And obviously, the concern being that after 210 days, when each visa is checked upon, they would look at the things you've done, the coverage you've been doing, and decide whether to renew it or not. So about half of our 150 staff in the States are on I visas. So that's a real concern. You're faced with the possibility of half your staff having, a real vulnerability just on being allowed to stay and work in the country. And I would say that's something we see also in other locations.
Okay, well, we've got a lawyer on the call, so let's get some free legal advice. David, I know you're not an immigration lawyer, but if a journalist on an I visa or on a green card is at a protest and gets arrested, what does that mean now? Before we just sort of would pay a fine or get away with it in some way, but I've had conversations with people who are really scared, and they ask me the question, like, what's going to happen to me if we get arrested down at a protest? Am I being kicked out of the country?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's I think the answer is we don't know, but clearly the risk is much higher. Right? We've seen what's happened to frankly a lot of student journalists, right? Obviously the tough student journalists and others being deported over the work they were doing. And there are, legal challenges pending to a number of those things. Obviously, so it is a real risk, and I do think it has to be when we talk about doing risk assessments, that take into account someone's full identity. Obviously, immigration status is part of that, and folks need to be prepared. I'm not saying that, we're not going to let folks do things, right? But folks need to be aware, right? That is our position, right? Folks need to be aware of the risk they're taking on when they're going to cover a protest and be comfortable with it. Look, the other thing we're thinking a lot about, and I don't think this is just us, is border crossings, and device seizures. Obviously, for years we've thought about, well, if a journalist is going to China, we need to be careful because devices might get seized or surveilled. Now when we have journalists, including U.S. citizens, coming back into this country, there's at least anecdotal evidence of journalists being targeted and subjected to additional questioning and, devices being seized. So we are, at this point, anytime any journalist at the Atlantic is leaving the country, we have a standard email that gives advice on how to think about protecting your devices when you come back through, and what to do if you're questioned. And if you're not a permanent resident, you can have entry denied. And so we're talking to those people differently and helping them think through how to attack this in a way that is both going to make sure they are as safe as possible, and also that we're taking steps to make sure that confidential news gathering work is not at risk.
Okay. And do these people, when they come through, do they have your number, or Alison, your very able deputy who was going to step into your shoes if you weren't around? I just mentioned her because I'm very grateful to her.
Yeah.
But do they have your number? Are you sort of prepped waiting for the call as they come through the border, or is it more relaxed than that?
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, we share numbers liberally. I mean, again, we are sharing this information with literally every single person who leaves the country and has got to be coming, including, a culture writer who's just going on vacation to see friends in Canada, right? And so, the vast majority of folks were not actually expecting anything to happen, and it's more about making sure they're mentally prepared should something happen. But there certainly have been a few other instances where folks are doing reporting on specific topics or in very, specific locales where we are, and frankly, you're right to credit Allison. Certainly, Allison is sitting there waiting by the phone to get that text saying, "Okay, I've cleared the border. All is fine."
Okay. And just out of interest, I mean, when you took this job, did you imagine you were going to be doing that, the sort of hotline for immigration? Or Alice?
No. Many things that I came to the Atlantic in the spring of 2017. So obviously the Trump administration had just gotten started. So I think there was perhaps a little bit in the tea leaves, but no, it's been a strange 9 years.
Okay, sorry, I digress slightly, but there is a very interesting question in the chat, which I would like each of you to sort of spend 30 seconds on, which is what is the most overlooked aspects or most common mistakes of journalist safety planning that organizations and individuals make when preparing journalists to cover difficult stories? David, do you want to start since you're on? Sorry to put you on the spot.
All right, why don't you come back to me? I'd love to hear what others say, and let me think about that for a second.
Phil, you probably have more experience than anyone else in sending people apps with nothing but a plan on a napkin.
The one thing I would say more than anything is the personal thing. The people who want to do this kind of stuff is really whether they have talked it properly through with their friends, family, and so on. Because the real time interaction with news at the moment is so intense that it's almost as if their families can be following events in Ukraine on social media, and every little thing that happens, and can create enormous strains and stresses back home. And I think sometimes people don't really factor in the very connected world in which we live and the effect that has on their family back home. So it's really just making sure that question has been asked, and that, as I've dealt with a lot of anxious families at different points during deployments, and the real-time nature of information at the moment really heightens that experience.
Okay, so bring the family into the loop of the planning, or at least information flow. Rana, what do you think is the biggest thing that we miss out on?
Honestly, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this, but honestly, I have been undercover doing a sting operation with multiple cameras on my body, doing an undercover operation on the ruling government right now. So honestly, I don't think, but I try to keep my digital footprint, especially if I'm going to report. I don't know where the organizations kind of make a mistake, but I do believe that there is a tendency that we often like to tell people where we are, what we are reporting. I guess uh, the digital footprint, and as Phil rightly pointed out, that we are living in a world where these things can be easily, one can easily be traced. Um, I just feel like we should not post or tell a lot of people about the kind of work that we are going to do, the story that we are going to cover, because that minimizes the risk. It has happened to me on the ground. Like I said, I was in a border area last year, and I informed 2 or 3 people that I'm going to come to Assam, which is a northeastern region of India. And the reason the intelligence guys got to know that I was going to travel there is because a few people that I called then called up other people to say that she's going to come, and then that set the entire chain of information, and that kind of alerted the officials, and then they started snooping on me. So I guess as less people as possible. Families, I think my families are perpetually worried about me, and I don't know how can one mitigate that, because I mean, somebody in an organization really needs to keep the family members in the loop, because when I was undercover, my family had no idea where I was for 6 months, whether I was alive, dead. So somebody really needs to, keep them updated in a way that does not freak them out about my situation, but also kind of makes them feel better about the way their family member is on the field. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this, really.
6 months without talking to your mum. I don't know if I could get away with that with my
They didn't
Indian
know
mum.
what I was doing, where I was, because I had to reduce the footprint because I was undercover with a different identity. And I could not jeopardize my safety by just calling up anybody from the family.
Okay. And David, what do you think of the big...
I mean, I think one of the things that we've learned, and maybe we don't always spend enough time on, is that it's not just, and this goes to the family thing, it's not just prepping the journalists, it's not just prepping the family, it's prepping a lot of different people across the organization. It's making sure that editors really understand their role in this, that they understand how to provide support. It's prepping your IT people to understand, the urgency of certain things, right? It's just getting full buy-in from everyone, because this is a team effort. And this isn't just like the one security person or the one lawyer and the journalist who are figuring this out. It has to be a real group effort. And I think, when an editor, again, that comes from advanced planning, right? When an editor is just doing this for the first time on 3 days' notice, that's not a great place. When you've been talking to the editors all along about how we're going to support journalists taking risk, I think that puts you in a better place.
Okay. And so preparation, planning, training, I assume you have a solid goal plan for the invasion of Greenland?
You're talking to me?
Well, I was talking to David, but I'm going to come to you, Phil.
Okay.
Sure. We'll say that we have a solid plan.
Phil, we joked about this a year ago. Have you opened your Greenland office yet?
Well, it's funny you say that. So we've just green-lighted a 6-month sort of deployment to Greenland. So I guess that might be the beginning of a Greenland bureau. We'll see what that wins. Obviously, we've been doing quite a few trips there in recent months. So we're going to plant the flag at least for 6 months and see how that goes.
Okay. I want to end with Rana, because Rana, as I said, I see India as a sort of crucible ahead of the curve of journalist suppression, which is a terrible moniker to have. But I was in a newsroom last year where people in an American newsroom, and they said, we spoke to our Indian colleagues, and it was so reassuring to hear people who have gone through this before. Do you have a hopeful message to journalists in the US and the UK? No hopeful message.
No, I mean, if the US is going to go through the same journey, which it looks like you have just started experiencing what we in India have been experiencing over the last 10 years. You have just begun to experience that churn, and our future as journalists in this country does not look very hopeful, because I'm talking about a country where the former defense minister, referring to journalists as prostitutes, the prime minister of the world's largest democracy, not take a single press conference, treating journalists as enemies of the state. More and more journalists are opting out of the mainstream, and independent journalists are talking about exhaustion. The stories that should come out of India as investigative journalists, the kind of long forms that we should expect from India, have reduced. Only foreign publications are doing that story. So I do not see a hopeful future for journalism in India. So I do not know if in America has the checks and balance, and how long can you sustain this attack on the free press? Because from what I have seen, I have no reasons to be optimistic, but I just hope that the owners of those journalism organizations and the editors and publishers hold their ground and make sure that the journalists do not suffer and journalism does not suffer eventually. But I do not have optimism to offer right now.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We have to end it. But why do you keep doing it then?
Because there are people who look up to me, whose voices are more important, whose stories are more important, and I feel they look up to me. And if I were to leave and go in exile or take asylum, I think that would be easier thing to do. Nothing against the people who do, but I believe that the India story, what's happening in India, is a warning to the world, and which is why the stories from India are more important. Which is why I need to do the journalism at whatever cost, because that's a choice that I've made. And I'm still a
Okay.
lot more privileged than other colleagues of mine.
Okay, great. Listen, I want to thank you all. It's been a really fascinating hour. It's gone by much faster than I thought it would. I want to apologize to people who asked questions on the chat that I didn't get to, but I'm very grateful to everyone. Hopefully, there is a more a hopeful note than Rana's giving out in this year. And but we all need to fight, as Rana keeps showing. After 15 years of abuse and online harassment, she's still here, still fighting the good fight. So I hope we can all take lessons from her. Thanks so much, David, Rana,
Thank you.
Phil.